Welcome to Nature Revisited, the podcast. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Norden, and thank you, everyone, for joining me on this episode with Boyce Upholt, the author of the new book, The Great River. But first, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Jonathan Siegel for his generous and continuing support for Nature Revisited. Without the support from Jonathan and others, Nature Revisited would not be possible. So thank you. Boyce Upholt is a nature critic whose writings probe the relationship between humans and the natural world. His work has been published in The Atlantic, National Geographic, Oxford American, and the Virginia Quarterly. He was awarded the 2019 James Beard Award for investigative journalism. He joins me from his home in New Orleans. Boyce, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast. I truly enjoyed reading your book, The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. And I am thrilled to be sharing your insights with my listeners about this mighty river. But first, let's start with you. You were raised in Connecticut, and in 2009, you moved to the Mississippi Delta. What was it that truly captivated you about the Delta to make you want to stay and not look back?
Yeah, I don't know that there was a specific moment when I kind of realized that I wasn't looking back, since I'm now in New Orleans. Before I ever moved to Delta, I had spent 2 years after college in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where I was a teacher briefly. What led me to the Delta was I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I didn't know how to do that. It seemed like as a guy from New England, it felt useful to wander off in places that felt exotic from my point of view. And the Mississippi Delta certainly felt exotic, and kind of fell in love with both those places, South Dakota and Mississippi. But at the same time, interestingly, that sort of parallels a growing environmental consciousness as well. But there was something about the literary history of Mississippi that as an aspiring writer, grabbed me, and it kind of forced me to start writing just because there were so many legendary storytellers. It kind of finally forced me to push into this life as a writer. And in doing so, I think I sort of became a Southerner. I don't imagine that I'll ever leave the South at this point.
When did you first start thinking about writing a book about the Mississippi, and why?
As you said, I got to Mississippi in 2009. Very interested in place as an idea. Interestingly, the Mississippi Delta where I was living, literally built by the Mississippi River. The soils were carried there over thousands of years and laid down and created what was once this very rich and vibrant cypress swamp that was then turned into this empire of farmland. But despite that geological history, for more than half a decade that I lived there, I basically rarely, if ever, saw the Mississippi River and basically never thought about it. I lived there in 2011, which was a year of historic flooding on the Mississippi. And so there's this massive flood happening 30 miles from my house. But I was reading about it in the New York Times because there's this levee that we built that holds back those sorts of floods. And it just keeps that land entirely separate from the river. And so it wasn't until like 6 years into my life in Mississippi, I was starting to get a little bit of traction as a writer, doing some journalism. There was this legendary figure in the Delta named John Rusty, who is like the canoe guide. Big beard and long hair. He's a grown-up Huck fan, so I convinced the publication to let me profile John, and went out camping and canoeing with John for 3 days and 2 nights, and was just sort of blown away when I got out on the river. So I'd been living in the Mississippi for 6 years, loved the landscape, but the landscape was very agricultural, which meant it was green, but also straight and regimented. And the river is extraordinarily wild. And so I was blown away that there's this wilderness space so close to my house. And I was also blown away that I didn't know it was there, that I had managed to live in that place for 6 years and not realize what a beautiful thing was right in my backyard. It wasn't quite immediate that I knew I'd write a book, but within a year, I think I knew I'd be writing a book about the river. What I knew at first is that I wanted to spend more time on the river. And as a young journalist, the easiest way for me to do that was to find more stories to write about it.
Can you give us an idea of how the Mississippi River was formed and what is its geological history?
The geological history is interesting. I mean, one of the things I had to consider in the book is like, when does this river start? It's hard to define when the Mississippi quite became the Mississippi, but I traced it back 600 million years to well before North America existed. One of the ancient supercontinents started to split apart, and in so doing, created a number of rifts. And one of those rifts, eventually that land sort of crumpled downward and formed what's called the Mississippi embayment. And so if you look at a topographical map of the United States, you'll notice from Memphis, or even a little bit north of Memphis, there's this big trough that just slopes down towards the Gulf of Mexico, and it's some of the lowest territory on the continent. And to me, it's the existence of this embayment, this big trough, that created the opportunity for a river like the Mississippi, a river that drains water from so much of the continent, but then also what's called an alluvial river, which means it's running through land that it has built itself. So essentially, over the years, the river carried mud from elsewhere and sand and dirt and just sediment and laid that down in that trough and built this entire landscape along the lower Mississippi River. Because it's an alluvial river, it's a very muddy river. The border between what is river and what is land is very hazy, and it's changing all the time. And so it's kind of curling on its way through this terrain because it's so low and flat. It's hard to have a straight line. And as it curls straight, it's going to dump some mud on one edge of a curl, and it's going to erode on the other edge. And so it meanders, it's called. And so it's constantly changing its shape. So it's just this soft, swampy place that is sort of naturally, because of these geological dynamics, that means that sort of anything we do to try and pin it in place is just fighting against the inherent nature of that geology.
And that's still happening today, correct?
It is, yeah. I mean, less so. We've built levees along the river, and those levees, if the river kind of shifted its path too much, those levees wouldn't be very useful. So there's a whole lot of work that goes into stopping that. We've essentially paved the banks in concrete for 1,000 miles, put all these dikes and dams in place to try and really have a precise control of the flow. But one of the things that I explored in the book is the way all of this engineering, it works for a decade or two. Almost always it seems to have some effects that we didn't predict. And so then we have to build something else. And it's this constant process of building like control structures to control our control structure.
You write that there were cultures and civilizations in the Mississippi Basin going back thousands of years. We know they were there because of some of the structures they left behind, which you call earthworks, and that are still there. Who were some of these cultures, and what do you think their earthworks mean?
In terms of who they were, I mean, in some ways, the most important culture is the Mississippian culture. We don't know what these people called themselves. So we have to piece together whatever we can about these cultures from material remnants and then to a certain extent from oral history that got passed down to more modern indigenous cultures that still live in these landscapes. Hernando de Soto was the first group of white men to see the Mississippi River, to cross the Mississippi River. Someone else had been in a watershed before him, but further west. And he did encounter late editions of this Mississippian culture. So the Mississippian culture arose around 1000 AD, a little bit later, had the most elaborate of these earthworks at a site called Cahokia. Cahokia had fallen before Soto arrived, but they were smaller Mississippian-style cities with earthworks at their center all over the continent, no longer just along the Mississippi River, but as far away as Georgia and the Carolinas. So he saw like a last glimpse of that, but then there was sort of this more than century-long period where no further white explorers saw the Mississippi River, and by the time LaSalle and the French came back, there's this just beyond decimation along the lower river, just this complete emptying out. Archaeologists call this the Mississippian shatter zone, and it's a zone in time and space that encompasses essentially much of the lower Mississippi River and beyond, and then surrounds those centuries of no white people being there. A couple of things seem likely to contribute to this. One is Soto himself. There may have been some political instability, and here comes these 700 white warriors. And then they were also likely bringing pathogens that indigenous people hadn't experienced before. So that would be part of it. And then by the time that European explorers came back to the river, Europeans did have a foothold elsewhere on the continent, and sort of colonialism was trickling into the river in the form of other indigenous people maybe being armed with rifles and coming in and raiding villages and rounding off people to sell to Europeans for slaves. So before Europeans actually sort of claimed and even saw the river much, already their presence was being felt as this shadow coming in from afar. So these earthworks, to describe them briefly, I mean, generally on the lower Mississippi River, where I see this form of spiritual architecture originating, it's a lot of flat-topped mounds. So it sounds very plain. It's just kind of like a pyramid with the top cut off. So it's like a flat platform built of soils, but they would be quite large, as much as 100 feet tall, and they're often arranged in sort of elaborate complexes in such a way that they are aligned with astronomical phenomena. This really, really impressive work, and it's this whole story of our continent that I didn't know at all until I started researching this book. We don't know what the people who built the earthworks thought, because they're in some cases hundreds of years old, in other cases thousands of years old. But I did try to pay attention to sort of indigenous storytelling today in cultures that are descended from the people who built these earthworks. The thing that struck me the most was what's called the three worlds theory, which is cosmology that says the world we're in is sort of an island, and there's a lower world below us. It's filled with chaos. It's a watery space. It's almost like I think of the Gulf of Mexico and all the hurricanes. And then there's an upper world, which is a sky-like space, but very precise in the way that like the sun rises and falls, and the moon is trackable, and the stars are trackable. At first it was just water, so just the lower world, and then some creature went down and pulled mud up from the bottom of that water and assembled the middle world that we're in. And that story has some resemblance to these earthworks. One of the theories is that the earthworks were almost a performative thing of people coming together to collaborate and recreate the world. And most of these earthworks they were built by egalitarian people that had no class divides, people that weren't even doing agriculture in most cases. And so they seem to me to be these incredible symbols of the way that people can come together and work together to build something and to reflect on their place in this sometimes difficult landscape. The question of the meaning of these structures just really stuck with me. Like, this is an entirely alternate way of conceiving of what it might mean to relate to the Mississippi River. And I think that's been the case for a lot of other people I spoke to.
Moving forward with its history, we come to the Louisiana Purchase. How was the Mississippi River part of the vision that Thomas Jefferson had for making that happen, and why did it fail?
So Thomas Jefferson was absolutely obsessed with the Mississippi River. He never saw it, had lots of maps and all of these records of explorers that had been out there. And Jefferson lived in this period when what America would become was not quite clear. The years before his presidency, there was a lot of debate. We've got this mountain range, the Appalachian Mountains. So a lot of people felt like that is sort of a natural border to the country. If anyone who lives beyond that border, it's going to be very hard to integrate them into one American society. But Jefferson had this essentially a political theory that I see as also a theory of landscape, and that he felt like democracy required individual landowners to be a truly effective democratic citizen. And it was important to, not be beholden to anyone else, which meant you couldn't have a job. You needed to be a farmer that was a self-sufficient farmer working on land that you owned yourself. And that was the way you'd be sure there's no nefarious influence coloring people's decisions. He had a vision of what he called an empire of liberty, where there's this whole empire of free people living on the land. To accomplish that, it was pretty clear, even by Jefferson's day, that we needed more space than we had on the eastern seaboard. And so that was why the Louisiana Purchase became so important to Jefferson. I mean, you ask why does vision fail, that empire of liberty vision? I think that there are several reasons. I mean, like one is that the terrain along the Mississippi is quite difficult. All of that chaos that I talked about earlier, all the flooding, all the swampiness, you needed a lot of money to keep water off your land and to drain it off your land. Farmers, as Jefferson conceived of them, just did not have the funds to do that. It tended to require someone who had a lot of slaves. So that's part of it. Part of it is, I think, that his empire of liberty vision was always more of a convenient symbol, kind of myth-making for himself. He was a planter and a slave owner, a conflicted one perhaps, but he didn't really create policies that would have truly effectively allowed this form of independent farmer. Third is I am skeptical of the idea that divvying up a continent into parcels of individual private property can ever fully work, in that, a watershed is deeply interconnected. And so it needs to be thought about in an interconnected way. And it's hard to do that when you've just sold it off in pieces to many different people.
So when did the U.S. Army of Engineers first become involved with the Mississippi River, and why?
So this was 1824. There had been some sort of disputes about steamboats, the very first steamboats on the Mississippi River. And in particular, Louisiana had granted one company a monopoly and said, you guys are the company for us. On our waterways, you're the only one that's allowed, which upset a lot of other people, particularly because New Orleans is such an important port. And so that meant like a steamboat company based in Louisville, Kentucky would not be able to run their boats all the way down. But by 1824, the Supreme Court came in and said, interstate commerce is one of the powers of the federal government. And at that time, the river was the highway. And so they decided that rivers were public property. A navigable river belonged to the federal government, belonged to the people. That's a first major step in the ideas of public land, but I don't think is often recognized because it's public water and not land. But that fact that now the river was public property meant that we kind of needed some sort of agency to take a look at it and oversee it. The Army Corps of Engineers had started during the Revolution just to make sure that the Continental Army had people trained enough to build bridges and fortifications, and they looked like a good group of people to first just kind of survey this river and then start instituting small changes to ensure that the river could be navigable for these steamboats. And then through the years, it's grown and grown and grown, and to become this sort of behemoth of an agency with a little bit of army, but there's more than 40,000 employees now, many of whom are civilians, and they build all kinds of things all over the country, all over the world. They're sort of our federal construction agency. They control the levees in the Southern River and the dams and reservoirs on all the tributaries.
So what would you say their track record is?
That is a good and complicated question. Several times already, people who've read the book have been like, oh, so the Army Corps is the villain in this tale, correct? Yes and no. One thing I want to point out is I think of the Army Corps as being almost like the tip of a cultural sphere, and that there was this very American idea. We want private property, we want permanent settlements, and so we have to tame and control this chaotic river, and the Army was the one tasked with doing that. There are many, many examples of projects in the past, like there's this giant canal that runs roughly parallel to the Mississippi River, but over in Alabama, and it's hardly used at all. In the late 90s, the Corps was sort of caught red-handed altering numbers to try and justify these projects because they get money from Congress to build anything. But it's an unfortunate system because they're also the one that recommends to Congress what should get built. And many of these projects have had severe ecological impacts. I do think today there's small changes. Recently, the Army Corps has announced that they're going to consider green infrastructure to see if that could be useful. And so there's a big study underway right now about the lower Mississippi River. I'm not super hopeful that there's going to be sort of a transformation in the Corps, but we're at a moment right now where we can watch and see it and hope that the Army Corps might make more thoughtful decisions about how to treat the river in the future.
Then there was the Great Flood of 1927. How did that flood really affect the future of the Mississippi River?
Maybe some listeners know about the flood of 1927. It's down in these parts where I am, but not everywhere. It's almost 100 years ago, so it's starting to be forgotten. I mean, this was basically the Hurricane Katrina of its era, where the Army Corps had built this levee all up and down the lower Mississippi River, and everyone kind of thought it was good. If we were done, we tamed the river, and then here comes this massive flood, and it just busts through the levee and so many places and leaves so much of the South just in tatters. Essentially, people are living in these refugee camps. In some ways, it very much changed what the Corps was doing, or on paper, it looked like what the Corps was doing. For several decades, there has been this flawed idea that levees can do it. If we just contain this river in levees, we're going to be able to beat the floods. This proved that wasn't going to work, that you have to give rivers room. And that's the big change that happened after the 1927 flood. Is rather than just levees, now the Army Corps built floodways, spillways, there are gates in the levee where they could open them up and send water into swampy places and relieve the pressure on cities, particularly down here in Louisiana where I am. So it looks on paper like a philosophical change, like the Army Corps got smarter, like the nation got smarter. I think in some ways the 1927 flood then just became a justification for the intensification of engineering. The levees got bigger afterwards. There's just been more and more engineering. And so we gave the river a little bit of room, but not enough, I think, is what we're seeing now. And so I think the 1927 flood just gave justification to take this long process of engineering the river and send it into hyperdrive.
After the Great Flood came the Great Depression. How did the Great Depression actually impact life along the Mississippi River, and in particular, the lower Mississippi?
Yeah, I mean, the Great Depression shaped the river up and down in some ways because it happened just in the wake of this 1927 flood where the government is saying, like, we got to do more building. And then all of a sudden, when you have FDR come in saying, well, the solution to the Great Depression is the government's going to spend a whole lot of money. And so all of a sudden there's money freed up to build locks and dams on the upper river. But your question about the lower river is apt because I think that landscape that I lived in the Mississippi Delta that I sort of found myself in as a 25-year-old was so deeply shaped by the Great Depression because money went not only to build these federal infrastructure projects, but money went to farmers that were living on what had once been the floodplain, but was now protected by all these levees. I think what the Great Depression did, if we ever had a shot at having those sort of like independent-minded farmers that Thomas Jefferson had talked about, we lost it then. Basically, the sugar economy was in shambles, and to help that out, the government was like, well, let's take some sugar land out of production, pay farmers just not to plant. The farmers at that point were working with sharecroppers, so those tenants were out of work, essentially. They were supposed to pass some of that money on, but nobody was checking on it. Oh, why would they do that? They pocketed this federal money, then often, in some cases, used it to buy tractors so that once they were able to plant again, they didn't need those tenants. And so it reshaped the human landscape along the river and drove this huge depopulation and created what we have today, which are these sprawling farms owned by a few very wealthy people, essentially. A lot of black laborers left, and those that didn't leave find themselves sort of in this place where there are few jobs and few prospects. So every county along the lower Mississippi River faces really stark rates of poverty. Those policies of the Great Depression, I think, really deepens that.
Your book shows us that there has been a long and complicated relationship with the Mississippi River. How does that relationship really show us just how flawed our relationship is with not only the river, but with nature?
One of the reasons why I decided to write this book, it struck me when I first paddled on the river, was the fact that, I had always been told the lower Mississippi River was basically a toxic canal. It's like a concrete trough. And that was not what I found at all. It looked like a wilderness. It was very obvious, like conceptually it couldn't possibly be a wilderness because it was so leveed and so engineered. It's one of the most engineered rivers on earth, but experientially it was a wilderness. And so one of the things that first attracted me to the river was the way it sort of upended these notions of what wildness is, what nature is. And that struck me, like learning the history of the river, particularly I now live in Louisiana. This is some of the youngest land in the world. New Orleans sits on, mud that's 5,000 years old. There were people here more than 5,000 years ago. So for the entire time the Delta landscape has existed, it's been a human landscape. And so again, that sort of upends the idea of what wild nature is. Nature is supposed to not contain humans. As I try and think about these overly grand questions of, what has the Mississippi River meant and what can we do with the Mississippi River in the future, that stuff matters, I think. I think it's a reminder of, particularly the fact that people lived here for so long without doing what America chose to do, which was try and tame and control this river. The river was never an easy place to live, but there are some advantages to all this chaos. It's a very lively place. It's a lot of food, a lot of seafood, a lot of good things here. And so I think that rethinking some of that might help us reconfigure the river not as a thing to control, but this entity that we can respect and live alongside.
The notion that nature has rights has been growing globally, especially concerning rivers. Have there been any movements along these lines concerning the Mississippi? And do you think that someday we will acknowledge that the Mississippi River does have certain rights and that we must honor them?
I love that you asked this question because as I was first working on this book, I was doing a bit of coverage about the rights of nature movement. There was a very interesting case where the White Earth Band of Anishinaabe in Minnesota, it's the largest federally recognized reservations of the Minnesota Chippewa, they were fighting against this oil pipeline that was being laid across their territory. And the way that a lawyer for the tribe decided to fight it was to invoke the rights of manumit, wild rice, and saying that this project was impacting this crop that was sacred to the White Earth Band, and that they had sort of protected rights of harvest for manumit, not only on their land, but elsewhere. There was a march across a bridge between, I think, Iowa and Illinois, with people, again, just calling attention to the rights of nature movement and trying to remind people of the importance of the Mississippi River and that it too may have rights. And so it is being discussed. Besides the case in Minnesota, I haven't seen sort of like formal action. Like you asked, do I think it will come? I hope it will come. I think it will be difficult because of the scope and scale of the river. It's so large. It touches so many states. There's so many federal agencies that oversee it. What governmental entity would be able to give it those rights? Give it those rights in a way that courts would recognize. That would be a complex thing. But I think that whether or not we recognize its rights, the Mississippi is going to assert its rights. Eventually, we are going to, over time, we'll be reminded again and again that we don't quite control it and that the territory we think is ours is often the rivers. It's going to happen one way or another. The way I did in the book, I returned to some discussions of the earthworks because I just think for the world to recognize the rights that the Mississippi should or does have, we just need a mindset shift first to care more about each other and about the world and stop thinking about natural resources as something we can sort of grab and control and think about the world as something that we need to collaborate with.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Boyce Upholt and that you take the time to read this fascinating book, The Great River, and visit his website, boyceupholt.com, to learn more about the work he is doing. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or our website, nordenproductions.com. I would also like to invite you to share your comments and ideas, and even suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Norden and Charles Gagan, and I hope you will join me for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, do remember, we are nature.